Welcome to the Heat Report by Chat Sports. I am your host, Nic Rohloff, and on today's show, we have a very juicy topic, and that is Giannis Antetokounmpo, because the NBA world was kind of set ablaze just a little bit on Thursday morning of Halloween, because Giannis Antetokounmpo rumors are out there on if he could potentially be traded this season and asked out of the Bucks organization. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me read off this quote from Bill Reiter, who works for CBS Sports. It says, "There's a rising sense of confidence that if things go badly in Milwaukee, that Giannis could be available for trade. Would really force his way out of Milwaukee in the next year." So many Heat fans wondered, could the Heat be in play for Giannis Antetokounmpo if he ultimately requested a trade? And we'll talk about why he would do that, what it would take for Miami, and what they should do if Antetokounmpo does become available. But then things took another step the same morning, because the same report from Bill Reiter had this to say. A third executive for an Eastern Conference team said they have heard Antetokounmpo's preferred trade destinations would be the Miami Heat or the Brooklyn Nets. So the Nets are an interesting part of this, but we're going to leave it out and only keep it a Miami-focused show today. But that's where Heat fans really started to get the idea of, could they trade? Could we acquire Giannis Antetokounmpo? Well, let's start here. And let's start with why Giannis would ask out. Well, the Bucks are 1-3 when we're filming this on Thursday afternoon. I don't know what they did on Thursday night, if they won against the Grizzlies or if they lost against Memphis. But either way, this roster is aging. They are very similar to the Miami Heat, where their window might have passed. They can no longer compete with the young teams in the East, like a Indiana Pacers, like an Orlando Magic, Boston Celtics, and they might need to revamp their roster because their roster is very old. Think about it. Damian Lillard, Chris Middleton, Brook Lopez, Bobby Portis. Those are the four best players surrounding Antetokounmpo, and at this point in his career, Chris Middleton simply just can't stay healthy. Damian Lillard isn't the player he once was in Portland, although I still like Dame. I think it's also fair to admit he is not that type of guy anymore. So could Giannis request a trade if things continue to go poorly? It's a small market in the Milwaukee organization, so I think it's possible that he might want to take his brand more global and go into a big market like most stars want to do. And with Doc Rivers at the helm for the Bucks, it would make a lot of sense for him to want to go ship out and go to a well-run organization with a really good head coach like Erik Spoelstra. So now the question remains, if he does ultimately want to go there, and now that we've kind of discussed that it could make sense for Giannis to eventually request a trade, when would this happen? Would it happen before the trade deadline in February of 2025, or would it be in the offseason? Well, I'll start with saying this, that if it is in the offseason, that does not help Miami, because I think if you were going to acquire Giannis Antetokounmpo, if you're the Miami Heat, it would be much easier and it would make your life a lot more fun and less stressful if you still had Jimmy Butler's contract on the books to potentially move in a Giannis trade. And I'll explain why in just a second. But quickly, let me know down in the comment section, would you want to trade for Giannis if he became available? Type Y for yes or type N for no. I also still have a hard time believing that a Giannis trade would happen at the deadline this season. To me, that feels way too quick of blowing it up. And I know there was a lot of rumors back in 2020-21 before he won a championship in Milwaukee after they acquired Jrue Holiday, that he could request a trade. Because if you remember, the year prior, they lost to the Heat in the bubble in the second round after a couple of other disappointing seasons in the postseason. If they never made that run to the finals and won it the following year after the bubble, I think Giannis might already be playing for a different team because he wants to win championships. He really is focused on winning at the highest level. He doesn't really care where he plays. Now, I do think it helps if he is in a big market, and I think he understands that. But all he cares about is winning. It's actually something I admire the most about Giannis, and it's the reason why he's one of the most sought-after stars if he became available in the NBA. Because unlike some players on Miami, Giannis plays hard every single time he's on the court, whether it's offensively or defensively. He is giving it his all. And sure, he's got his defects, whether it's the lack of a jump shot, lack of an ability to hit free throws down the stretch. He makes up for it in his pure physical domination, his determination to win games no matter if it's in December or in April. And that is something I really admire about Giannis and why I would be very intrigued to bring him into the Heat organization and pair him up to what probably would be with Bam Adebayo. Because if you're thinking going forward for Miami, in acquiring Giannis in a trade, which is where we'll take it here next, what are the Heat offering? Well, they don't have a lot of draft picks, so it would have to be player related. And I know a lot of people are going to say, what is an all-in package? Well, to me, an all-in package is one of Jimmy or Bam, if this happens before the deadline. And let's act as if it is going to happen at the deadline, because they have a really poor season and the Bucks want to blow it up this year rather than waiting to the offseason. Let's act under that assumption here in this scenario. Well, then you trade one of Jimmy and Bam. And now the Bucks are clearly going to want Bam Adebayo more than Jimmy Butler because Bam is younger and he's more ascending as a player rather than Jimmy Butler, as he is descending inside the NBA and has a higher price tag. So when you think about this, they're going to want Bam. But the Heat aren't going to trade Bam. They just aren't. As much as you are frustrated with Adebayo potentially with his start to the season, as I am offensively, he's still doing a lot of good things defensively, even though he got cooked by Cat on Wednesday. You aren't trading him because he is the guy you're building your team around. And if you are acquiring Giannis Antetokounmpo, you are still trying to win a championship by making that trade because you are getting a top 5 player in the NBA in Giannis. And there is no better person to pair Giannis up with on your roster already than Bam Adebayo. Their defensive front court would be the best defense in the NBA. It might be a top 5, top 10 defensive duo in NBA history. That's how dominant they could be on that end. When you have Giannis and Bam's ability to guard both centers, forwards, threes, and even some twos, that becomes a difference maker. You can switch 1 through 5 with those two, as well as leave the 2 of them on centers if you need be, because Giannis is built like a freak. That's why his nickname is the Great Freak, where he can body up and outmuscle some centers, as well as use his wingspan and athleticism to really defend and rebound inside. It would be an all-time defensive duo, and I would be watering at the mouth, I should say, to have those two play together. Now, I do think it is a far-fetched dream that any of this comes to fruition, but it would be fantastic. We know both of those guys are depoy caliber players. Giannis is an MVP caliber guy. That would be that number 1 option that you can give the ball to in the regular season and trust him to give you offensive output every game, which would then let your guards play off of him so much better. Giannis is a superstar, an all-NBA first-team guy day in, day out, which would make this team so much better. So now that we have declared that if you were going to make a Giannis trade, you are likely trying to trade Jimmy Butler rather than Bam Adebayo before the deadline. Well, then what does a trade look like? Now, the Bucks are currently in the second apron, which means you cannot aggregate contracts to make a deal in a one-on-one trade. Now, I will say this, Jimmy Butler and Giannis at this current juncture both make $48.7 million. So hypothetically, you could do a Giannis-Jimmy Butler swap plus draft capital. The only issue with that is that the Heat don't have enough draft capital to make that trade. They have at most 2 tradable first-round picks. That's not going to cut it with Jimmy and 2 first-round picks to get Giannis, and they can't take any salary back. So if you said, hey, Jimmy, Jovic, Jaquez, 2 first-rounders to Milwaukee straight up, can we get it done? Well, that still doesn't work because they can't take back the salary of Jovic and Jaquez, which makes this a 3-team deal, which ultimately could help Miami in a lot of different ways, because then you can ultimately get more draft picks going to Milwaukee, which is what the Bucks organization might want and prioritize if they do a Giannis trade rather than getting a star player like Jimmy Butler. So I cooked up a 3-team trade that gets a little chaotic, and you're going to have to stay with me as I describe it here because it's quite a doozy. It includes the Houston Rockets, Miami Heat, and Milwaukee Bucks. And why the Rockets are so important here is because there has already been a report out there that they have interest in a Jimmy Butler trade. And if they keep that interest and the Heat and Bucks ultimately decide to start to talk about a 3-team deal at the trade deadline, well, then Jimmy going to Houston is very key here because the Rockets have a lot of draft capital that can help facilitate a trade for Miami. So in this deal, the Rockets get 1 player and 1 player only. That is Jimmy Butler. And what I value Jimmy at is what I have done in the past of 1 young player, salary filler, and a first-round pick. And in this one, I am praying a priority, and which makes this unlikely. And if projecting a 3-team deal, it's a little unlikely that this actually happens and I go perfect in the trade details. but I have the Houston Rockets sending Jabari Smith Jr., Dylan Brooks, and 2 first-round picks, the one from either Phoenix or OKC in 2025, plus their own 2028 first-round pick, to the Milwaukee Bucks. The Bucks also get 2 first-round picks from Miami in 2029 and 2031, unprotected, as well as Haywood Highsmith and Jaime Jaquez Jr. You might be wondering why some of these players are involved. A lot of it is contract-based to make it work for all 3 sides. But in Miami's eye here, you are then giving up Jimmy, Jaime, Haywood, and 2 unprotected first-round picks for Giannis Antetokounmpo. And now this trade wouldn't be able to be executed until after December because of Haywood Highsmith's new signed contract, but it wouldn't happen until likely January, February for the trade deadline, right? So I think it's fair on Miami's side. You might be actually underpaying in this situation by only giving up Jimmy, Jaime, Haywood, and 2 first-round picks, but that's why sending Jimmy to Houston to use their 2 first-round picks, sending 4 total first-round picks to Milwaukee, plus a couple young guys in Jaime and Jabari and salary filler means so much. Also in this deal, the Heat are getting Giannis Antetokounmpo as a 1 player, plus Jock Landale because of his $8 million contract, but that's all just salary filler with Jock Landale and players like Dylan Brooks and Haywood Highsmith. But I know it's a lot to digest, but let's focus this on a Miami perspective. You're giving up Jimmy, Jaime, Haywood, and 2 first-round picks unprotected to get Giannis and Jock Landale. I think if this trade was even feasible and the Houston Rockets and Milwaukee Bucks would play ball on this potential 3-team deal, you do it in a heartbeat. Like I said, you get younger with Giannis. He's only 29. Bam and Giannis are very similar in age. So you'd have them 2 as a duo for the next 5-6 years as they go into their early, mid-30s. It would be a great pairing defensively and offensively. And yes, you get rid of Jaime, who is your best young player with the most potential in terms of actual young guys. Jaime being 24, that is. I still think it's worth it, and I don't think it's even a question. Giannis is a unicorn-type player. If he becomes available via trade, you do everything in your power to try to make that happen. And I think Pat Riley, as much as we like to slander him, at times of not giving enough and not negotiating fairly with some of these other GMs and organizations, I think he would understand that Giannis is such a unicorn-type player. Him, Anthony Edwards, Luka, these type of guys that are young, dominant at their respective positions in their respective teams, that if they do become available, there is no downside to trading for them. So you would offer everything you possibly could. And even I will admit, you are not offering both Jimmy and Bam for Giannis. You can't do that. You don't get any better. You don't. Giannis is a top 5 player, but yes, even with Jimmy and Bam being frustrating, those 2 still combine for more a productive asset than just one Giannis Antetokounmpo. So you're trading one of them. And I would have it be Jimmy Butler if it's before the trade deadline. And that's how we're acting, as that is the scenario here in today's video. Now, that is very different if this happens to be in the offseason, because now you are going to have to talk about doing this in a 3-team sign-and-trade deal, because Jimmy's likely going to opt out. He's going to get a new contract, and you would have to sign to that contract and then trade him, and it becomes a lot more complicated in the offseason. But at the deadline, this type of 3-team deal makes the most sense. And maybe you can even incorporate a different team, like the Golden State Warriors, who have multiple picks that might want Jimmy Butler. Like, if you were doing a deal at the deadline, it is going to have to be a 3-team deal where you are sending Jimmy to a different team and using those picks you get in return plus young guys to reroute him to Milwaukee alongside your own picks and young guys to acquire Giannis. It's far-fetched, but with how good Giannis is as a player on the offense and defensive end, the pedigree of a champion, an MVP, the unbelievable duo that would be created defensively of Giannis and Bam, I would do it no hesitation. And if it actually comes to fruition where Giannis requests a trade, there should be no hesitation from the Miami Heat to go all in and find a way to try to make it happen. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen, and he gets dealt somewhere else to either Houston or Brooklyn, who have a million draft picks, fine. But you need to do everything in your power to try to make that happen if Giannis does ultimately request a trade. All right, that's going to do it for today's show. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We are still going to be going live for Miami Heat games. Not live on Saturday, late game on a football weekend against the Wizards. We'll be back on Monday for a watch party against the Kings. We'll also be live next Wednesday and Friday against the Suns and Nuggets as the Heat start a little West Coast road trip. So make sure you subscribe and join the channel because we're not going anywhere here at the Heat Report.